Reporters risk their lives every day to bring the truth to the masses, and they sometimes pay the ultimate price to do so. Whether they were at the wrong place at the wrong time or simply the victim of a tragic diagnosis, these reporters were taken far before their time. An accomplished journalist and a would-be superstar of television news, Jessica Savitch joined NBC News in 1977. She quickly ascended the ranks, becoming weekend anchor of the NBC Nightly News, while also appearing on NBC News Digest, a series of one-minute briefs that aired between primetime shows. She won 4 News Emmy Awards and commanded a salary from NBC of $500,000 a year, an astronomical sum at the time for a television journalist, especially a woman. She wasn't without controversy either. Colleagues criticized her journalism experience, which, if you think that sounds like jealousy, you're probably not wrong, but also her private life and what she did during it, if you catch my drift. A 1983 newscast where she slurred some words didn't help quiet those rumors.
President Reagan has canceled his planned visit to the Philippines. The White House blamed the press of congressional business, but did not deny fear for the president's safety.
On the night of October 23, 1983, Savitch left a restaurant in New Hope, Pennsylvania with New York Post Vice President Martin Fishbein. According to investigators, Fishbein had trouble seeing as he tried to navigate through a severe rainstorm. The car drove over gravel past 2 caution signs and down a wall bordering the Delaware Canal.
There's no guardrail to keep you from driving right into it.
The station wagon plunged into the water and flipped, landing on its roof in 5 feet of water. Savitch and Fishbein were trapped inside and drowned. Savitch was only 36 years old.
We need higher ratings. If it bleeds, it leads.
You've heard that before, and Christine Chubbuck had too. When she started at WXLT in Sarasota, Florida, the station made do with dated equipment and low budgets, so the owner thought that he could boost ratings and revenue by airing stories as salacious, visceral, and violent as broadcast television would allow. Chubbuck was disgusted by the switch, and after voicing her concerns with management, she continued to produce more thoughtful, sedate feature stories, many of which went unaired or were pushed in favor of more shocking content. During a live daytime broadcast on July 15, 1974, Chubbuck decided to call out her station's approach to news coverage and a horrifically sad act of violence.
She said, "In keeping with Channel 40's policy of bringing you the latest in blood and guts, you're going to see another first."
Chubbuck then shot herself. She died at a hospital 14 hours later. She was 29 years old. A couple of things we need to clear up here. Yes, she did have a serious bout with depression that was not properly treated, and despite whatever you think you found on the internet, the tape of the incident has never been shown since a live airing of it. Reporter Daniel Pearl worked for the Wall Street Journal overseas as chief of the newspaper's Southeast Asia Bureau. Following everything that happened on September 11th, Pearl ventured into Pakistan to uncover potential ties between Pakistani government officials and Al-Qaeda. On January 23, 2002, Pearl was en route to Karachi to interview a radical Islamic cleric when he was kidnapped by a group that claimed Pearl was an American spy. In exchange for Pearl's life, the terrorists demanded the release of all Pakistani prisoners from U.S. prisons and that a shipment of F-16 fighter planes be sent to the Pakistani government. On February 1, 2002, just over a week after the kidnapping, video was released showing Pearl at gunpoint holding a newspaper. He was forced to read a statement acknowledging that he was a Jewish American and had visited Israel. He was then executed on camera. Several months later, Pearl's remains were discovered in a field in the town of Gadab. The reporter was 38 years old. Pearl's son, Adam Daniel Pearl, was born 4 months later. In February 2023, Dylan Lyons, a 24-year-old TV reporter, and photojournalist Jesse Walden were getting out of their vehicle in Pine Hills, Florida, just outside of Orlando, to file a report on an earlier homicide that day. All of a sudden, they were shot at. Walden was seriously injured but survived. Lyons didn't. He died at a hospital early the next morning as a result of multiple gunshot wounds. That day, area police arrested Keith Melvin Moses for both crimes. He returned to the scene of the original shooting, shot at the news crew, then entered a nearby private home and shot 2 residents, killing a 9-year-old girl. None of the 3 separate homicides were connected in any way. In January 2025, Lyons' family filed a lawsuit against News 13, his employer, alleging, among other things, that the risk assessment was not properly taken into account before sending him on that assignment. On June 28, 2018, an armed man stormed into the offices of the Capital and Maryland Gazette newspapers in Annapolis, Maryland, and began firing. In the initial attack, 5 staff members were shot and killed. Community reporter Wendy Winters, sales officer Rebecca Smith, sports reporter John McNamara, editorial editor Gerald Fishman, and assistant editor Rob Hyacin. Several more employees were injured. Following the assault, police discovered the gunman, Gerald Ramos, hiding under a desk. The suspect had long antagonized the Capital Gazette. In 2011, after the paper ran a story about his guilty plea on a charge of criminal harassment, Ramos sued for defamation.
The newspaper won the case, reporting on what was already public record.
Ramos began sending threatening letters to the paper, the last one arriving on the day of the shooting. In 2021, a judge sentenced Ramos to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. On August 26, 2015, reporter Alison Parker and photojournalist Adam Ward, who were working for station WDBJ-7's news team in Roanoke, Virginia, headed to Bridgewater Plaza on Smith Mountain Lake in Monetta for another one of those happy AM morning news stories to start your day on a good note. Just before 7 a.m., they went live. And while interviewing the Chamber of Commerce executive director, they were attacked by a gunman.
For a split second during the live broadcast, viewers were able to see the gunman before he ran off.
The attacker, Vester Lee Flanagan II, uploaded body camera footage of the assault to his social media accounts, meaning TV viewers and people on Facebook all saw it happen live. Flanagan, a former employee at WDBJ-7, sent a letter to ABC News stating that the shooting had been an act of protest as a result of the poor treatment he'd received at the station as an LGBT person of color. He took his own life later that day. Parker, 24, and Ward, 27, were pronounced dead at the site of the shooting. Ed Bradley is a major figure in the history of 60 Minutes, arguably the longest-running, most acclaimed news series of all time. Assertive, persistent, and at times unabashedly emotional, Bradley was one of TV's most prominent and prolific journalists. For his many decades of work at CBS, Bradley was awarded 19 News Emmys. In November 2006, Bradley died from chronic lymphocytic leukemia at Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York City. He'd been diagnosed several years earlier, but he kept his illness private until just before his death. Not even his long-standing 60 Minutes collaborators knew Bradley was sick. Bradley continued to hunt down stories until just a few days before his death at the age of 65. During World War II, CBS reporter Edward R. Murrow delivered frequent visceral news reports to American listeners from the European theater. In his reporting, Murrow provided mood and context in addition to the raw facts, helping to build radio into a popular, even vital news format. In fact, he was one of the first stars of the startup broadcast news medium.
Ed was theatrical, and I'm not sure he wanted to be or tried to be, he just was.
In Murrow's CBS series See It Now, which aired from 1951 to 1958, he dove deep into the complex issues of the day, with both the facts and his own thoughtful commentary, creating what eventually became the formats of today's television news broadcasts, as well as small-screen nonfiction programming. Murrow worked for CBS until 1961, when President John F. Kennedy appointed him to head the U.S. Information Agency. Throughout his life, Murrow smoked as many as 70 cigarettes a day, often on air. In 1963, he was diagnosed with lung cancer, and he retired from the news business the following year after the removal of his left lung. Murrow died in April 1965 at the age of 57.
This guy was a tenacious, badass, take no prisoners investigative reporter.
For 14 years, investigative reporter Don Bolles worked for Phoenix's Arizona Republic, rooting out government corruption, fraud, and organized crime. As Bolles pulled out of a parking spot in a Phoenix hotel in June 1976, a remote-controlled bomb detonated under his car. The 47-year-old Bolles survived for 10 days, but ultimately succumbed to his injuries. President Gerald Ford issued a statement reading, "I am distressed and outraged that a reporter in search of truth became an apparent victim of the underworld."
It's just something I do every year is to come to this spot. To me, it's kind of a holy spot of journalism.
Bolles, father of 7 and a Pulitzer Prize nominee, had upset many high-profile dangerous people in his 14 years on the beat. Authorities focused on suspects named by Bolles after the attack, one of which was John Adamson, a shady Phoenix figure later arrested for fraud. Hours after Bolles' death, Adamson was arrested and charged with murder. He later testified that he'd set the bomb for a contractor associated with liquor distributor Kemper Marley Sr., about whom Bolles had written unflattering articles. The Lebanese Civil War lasted 15 years, from 1975 to 1990, claiming its first fatal journalist casualty in 1983. Veteran war correspondent Clark Todd was head of the London Bureau of CTV Television Network, Canada's state broadcaster, but he was sent by the network to the Shuf region in the mountains of Lebanon to cover the war from the front lines. On September 4th, in the midst of heavy fighting, an airborne piece of debris struck Todd hard in the chest. Realizing he was likely mortally wounded, Todd encouraged the rest of the team to leave him and get to safety. He succumbed to his wounds, and it wasn't until a week later that his body could be recovered. His final act was to write a goodbye message to his family on a pillowcase. Clark Todd was 38 years old. Todd C. Smith was an investigative reporter with the Tampa Tribune who specialized in stories about Latin America. In 1987, he was embedded with rebel Contras in Nicaragua for 10 weeks. His dispatches were syndicated widely across American newspapers. Then, in November 1989, Smith used his vacation time to research cocaine trafficking in Upper Huallaga, the northern jungles of Peru. At the time, the region was controlled by the Maoist revolutionary group The Shining Path. Somehow, Smith ran afoul of the organization, described by many as a terrorist group, and vanished. By November 15th, no one in Tampa had heard from him. He'd been regularly checking in with the U.S. Embassy during his time in country, but the check-ins had ended on November 17th. Days later, a body was discovered beside a highway, along with a slab of wood on which the Shining Path had allegedly written, "Death to the North American imperialism. Long live the Communist Party." Embassy workers confirmed that the body was that of the 28-year-old Smith. Tribune editor Carl Cruthers told UPI he had a taxi receipt in his pocket with his name on it. He'd been tortured and beaten. Investigators said he'd also been shot, either by the Shining Path or hired contract killers. In Thailand, between March and May of 2010, a group called the United Front for Democracy Against Dictatorship, also known as Red Shirts, took to the streets to protest a military-backed government that had been in power since 1992. Protests turned into demonstrations, which turned into riots. Armed agents of the government fired on the Red Shirts, who responded with homemade gas bombs, slingshots, and small arms fire. During a particularly violent days-long skirmish in mid-April 2010, more than 120 people were injured. As Red Shirts and soldiers shot at each other, TV camera operator Hiroyuki Muramoto was caught up in the chaos. Muramoto, who had worked for NBC and Australia's ABC, was employed by the Japanese branch of Reuters. This wasn't his first time in a war zone. He'd covered dangerous situations in North Korea and the Philippines. But on this occasion, a bullet intended for someone else struck Muramoto in the chest. He was pronounced dead on arrival at Klang Hospital in Bangkok. The photojournalist was 43.
You can call it racism, but it's simply obedience to the instincts for species preservation.
Well, when a neo-Nazi group calls itself the Order and its stated mission is to eliminate whoever it considered to be enemies of the United States at the time, including members of the LGBTQ community, people of color, feminists, and Jewish people, well, the shoe fits. The first individual the Order decided to silence was controversial Denver talk radio host Alan Berg. Berg, who is Jewish, hosted a popular call-in show on local radio station KOA, where he discussed race, religion, and plenty of other hot-button topics. Berg was known for his confrontational approach, often putting those with opposing points of view on the spot.
Berg was well known for using his talk show to taunt bigots and racists.
Berg was a frequent recipient of death threats even before the Order got involved. But on June 18, 1984, one of those threats became reality. He was shot and died on the spot in the driveway of his home in Denver's Congress Park area.
It was clearly a message killing, 13 slugs from a machine gun.
Of the 4 people involved in Berg's killing, 1 was shot by the FBI, while 3 others were arrested and given long prison sentences. Berg's life and death were the inspiration for Oliver Stone's 1988 film Talk Radio. He was 50 years old. Before he became the editor of the Oakland Post, Chauncey Bailey was a foreign correspondent stationed in Haiti and Vietnam, as well as a reporter for the Detroit News and the Oakland Tribune. Bailey was a journalistic crusader. At about 7:30 a.m. on August 2, 2007, Bailey was shot on a street in downtown Oakland while walking to work. According to witnesses, a van drove up and an assailant jumped out and fired multiple shots, then fled the scene. Bailey was dead by the time authorities arrived. He was 57 years old. Yusuf Bey IV, community leader and founder and CEO of Your Black Muslim Bakery, was later arrested and sentenced to prison for ordering Bailey's killing. But why? Bailey was working on a story that would have exposed Bey's shady business dealings and his fall from grace after an arrest on sexual assault charges. Bey, who apparently had a lengthy hit list, had hired a contract killer to carry out the assassination. On August 19, 1997, police in Colebrook, New Hampshire pulled over Carl Draga in the parking lot of a grocery store. Immediately after State Trooper Scott Phillips exited his vehicle, Draga pulled out an assault rifle and started shooting at him. At that time, another trooper, Les Lord, arrived on the scene. Draga shot him too. Both officers died as a result of their wounds. Draga then took off in Phillips' police car and drove himself to the nearby offices of Judge Vicky Bunnell and the Colebrook News and Sentinel. Draga intended to kill Bunnell, and as he approached, she fled the building on foot. As she cried out warnings to staff members on the premises, Colebrook News and Sentinel editor Dennis Joos tried to get between the shooter and his target. According to what Lieutenant Chuck West of the New Hampshire State Police told WMUR 9 of Manchester, Dennis Joos very heroically tried to intervene. He grabbed Draga, got into a physical altercation, and subsequently was shot and killed right there on the lawn.
If there ever was anything that matched, any person that matched the term hero, Dennis Joos.
Draga also shot and killed Bennell, and after driving away, tried to shoot and kill a Fish and Game Department officer and another state trooper. Lieutenant West shot and killed Draga, but not before 4 innocent people lost their lives, including Joos, the 51-year-old editor of the small town's tiny newspaper. Reporter and investigative journalist Nicholas Tomalin wrote on a variety of domestic and international topics for the Sunday Times out of London, and also co-wrote the 1970 nonfiction bestseller The Strange Last Voyage of Donald Crowhurst. He thrived as a war correspondent, filing stories from the front lines in Vietnam. Then, in 1973, the Sunday Times dispatched Tomalin to Syria to cover the unfolding Yom Kippur War. Syria and Egypt had both attacked the Jewish state of Israel at the same time, or the Jewish holy period of Yom Kippur. In the course of the fighting, they hit an Israeli settlement in the Golan Heights, where Tomalin headquartered while he filed stories. He was killed in a strike by a Syrian rocket. Tomalin was 41 years old. The UK-based Press Gazette would later name him one of the 40 best journalists of the modern era. During the US Civil War in the 1860s, photography was still a very young, cumbersome medium. Journalists who covered the devastating battles had to rely on their words to convey the scene, or else they could draw or paint the horrors around them. Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper promised original imagery with its Civil War reporting, and that coverage made much use of the talents of James R. O'Neill. Prior to the war, O'Neill made his living as a stage painter, conjuring murals for musical productions in Wisconsin, until Harper's Weekly hired him to contribute illustrations of battles being fought in the vast American West. In 1862, O'Neill, as a non-combatant, was allowed to join the 3rd Wisconsin Cavalry under the direction of General James G. Blunt. At the Battle of Honey Springs, O'Neill drew elaborate scenic depictions of the fighting, one of which was published in 1863 alongside a written account in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. But when O'Neill's company moved on to fight in the Battle of Baxter Springs in Kansas, he was killed. He was 30 years old. O'Neill is considered the only member of the press killed in action during the Civil War. Journalist and diarist Thomas William Bowlby was among the first war correspondents ever employed by the Times, the London-based newspaper that was the dominant mass media source in 19th century Western Europe. Having made a name for himself with reports dispatched from Berlin in 1848 covering social revolutions, Bowlby also delivered a dramatic account of the sinking of the SS Malabar in Sri Lanka in May 1860, because he'd been on board the vessel. In 1860, the Times sent Bowlby to China to cover what would be the final days of the Second Opium War, fought by the English and French troops against the ruling Qing Empire. Bowlby's unflinching accounts detailed the horrors of war, including French troops' deadly bayonet attacks and British soldiers killing innocent civilians. Sometime after September 16, 1860, Bowlby traveled with 2 representatives of the British Crown to cover peace talks with the Qing leaders. The meeting went badly. Negotiations deteriorated to the point where Bowlby and both envoys were apprehended and imprisoned and tortured. Qing agents killed the 42-year-old Bowlby in Beijing on September 22nd. In retaliation, British military leader Lord Elgin directed his troops to burn down the Qing Emperor's estate, the Old Summer Palace. In March 2015, civil war kicked off in Yemen. The Ansar Allah sect, identified by some authorities as a terrorist organization, rebelled against the established government, which was supported by Middle Eastern neighbors, including Saudi Arabia. In the first 9 months of fighting, 5,800 citizens were killed. Freelance print journalist and television reporter Almigdad Mojalli considered fleeing his home country because the situation had grown so frightening, but he opted to remain in Yemen to report on the war. On the morning of January 17, 2016, Mojalli accompanied Yemen digital media reporter Bahir al-Sharabi to Sana'a, where Ansar Allah kept its headquarters, in order to investigate a recent round of Saudi-led airstrikes which had left 15 area residents dead. About 20 minutes after they arrived, the reporters were bombarded with falling explosives. Al-Sharabi briefly lost consciousness, and when he awoke, he discovered Mojalli gravely injured. He and others in the area got Mojalli into a car, where he died before they could reach a hospital. The journalist was 34 years old. Oregon-born journalist John Reed was an avowed communist who covered, among other subjects, the Union labor movement, the Mexican Revolution, and World War I. His personal passion was with communist movements, so Reed went to Russia in 1917, just before the Bolshevik Revolution, when rebels seized the country and instituted communist rule. Reed worked as a field reporter, eventually collecting his writings from the time in his classic 1919 book, 10 Days That Shook the World. The newly installed communist government considered the book to be an objective and favorable account of events. Shortly after he finished his book, Reed noticed that the communist government had shifted focus away from empowering the masses and began instead to put their efforts toward punishing their enemies. Reed left Russia, but he was traveling without a visa and was arrested and sent to prison in Finland. Upon his release, he returned to Russia, where he began to focus on probing communist leaders about economic issues, but he soon fell too ill to work. Generally unhealthy after prison and diagnosed with kidney disease, Reed came down with typhus and died in a Moscow hospital in October 1920. Named a hero of the revolution by the Soviet government, Reed was buried in the National State Cemetery at the Kremlin Wall.